All right, everyone, welcome to today's video on the Minnesota W4 equivalent. And now here are the Minnesota employer instructions. Previously, everything was that was listed before was the employee instructions. And so this is the part where the state of Minnesota tells you that if there's a lock-in letter, which is the IRS letter 2800C, tells you when the IRS believes your employee may have filed an incorrect federal W-4. And if you receive this letter, you must provide the Minnesota Department of Revenue with a copy of the employee's form Minnesota W-4. And Minnesota Department of Revenue is the we here that will verify the number of allowances that the employee may claim on for Minnesota purposes and continue to use the form W4MN that you were using at the time that you receive IRS letter 2800C until Minnesota Department of Revenue notifies you of a change to the amount of allowances on the employee's Minnesota W4. But if the employee has not completed a Minnesota W4, you have to have them complete the form and submit that to the Minnesota Department of Revenue. So here is a really black and white area that if the employer receives an IRS letter 2800C, they have to get a Minnesota W4 from the employee and send that into the Minnesota Department of Revenue. If they don't, there will be a $50 penalty assessed. When does an employee have to complete a W4MN? It's the same as completing a federal W4. It is no later than when they begin employment or when their personal or financial situation changes. Now, the employers aren't going to know when a personal or financial situation changes for sure. However, if somebody comes to work and they're all excited about getting married or all excited about getting divorced, then the employer will reasonably be expected to know that the personal or financial situation changed. And, sometimes I've seen where people get promotions. Part of their packet includes new federal or state W-4s because that can change their financial situation. And that is another time where a business would be reasonably expected to know that their financial situation changed. But you can't make an employee fill out a new W-4 if you suspect a change has taken place. You keep using the Minnesota W-4 and federal W-4 until they provide you with new ones. And if they've not filled out Minnesota withholding or Minnesota W-4, then the employer will use a federal W-4 from 2019 or prior years that's on file. You can use the allowances on the federal W-4. Otherwise, you withhold Minnesota tax as if the employee is single with zero withholding allowances, and which is the highest tax withheld possible without filling out the extra withholding. What if my employee claims to be exempt? If your employee claims to be exempt from Minnesota withholding, they fill out section 2. They provide you with a new Minnesota W-4 by February 15th of each year. If you're paying an employee for wages that are exempt from withholding, such as Medicaid waiver payments or wages to H-2A visa workers, do not send a form W-4MN to the Department of Revenue. However, you do need to submit copies of the Minnesota W-4 to the Department of Revenue if the employee claims more than 10 withholding allowances. And yes, we've covered this already, but it's really important. So I'm going to read it again. and the employee checked box A or B under section 2, and you reasonably expect the employee's wages to exceed $200 per week, you believe the employee is not entitled to the number of allowances claimed, you don't need to submit a Form W-4 MN to the Department of Revenue if the employee is asking to have additional Minnesota withholding deducted from their pay. And the Minnesota Department of Revenue may assess a $50 penalty for each W-4 MN not filed with Minnesota Department of Revenue when required. And you'll mail them to the Minnesota Department of Revenue, Mail Station 6501, 600 North Robert Street, St. Paul, Minnesota 55146 6501. And it doesn't have a deadline to get them mailed in. But I always tell my employers to follow the same rules with Minnesota new hire reporting. You have 20 days. I would mail a W-4 that you get from an employee that meets the qualifications on when it's required to be submitted to the Minnesota Department of Revenue within 20 to 30 days at the most. And if you have an employee who resides in a state that has a reciprocity agreement with Minnesota, the employee will complete a form MWR, Reciprocity Exemption Affidavit of Residency, if both they are a resident of North Dakota or Michigan, and they do not want you to withhold Minnesota tax from their wages. And this is an exemption from withholding that does not need to be mailed into the Minnesota Department of Revenue. And again, the MWR expires December 31st every year and is required to be completed no later than February 28th of each year, or within 30 days after they begin working or change their permanent residence. What's an invalid Minnesota W-4? It's when there's an unauthorized change or addition to the form, including any change to the language clarifying the form is correct. The employee indicates in any way the form is false by the date they provide you with the form is incomplete or lacks necessary signatures. Both sections 1 and 2 are complete, or the employer information is incomplete. So I very rarely see the employer information filled out on the Minnesota W-4, but anytime the form has to be submitted to the state, it is required to be there. If it's not, it's incomplete and invalid. And anytime the state of Minnesota wants to see all your W-4s, you need to make sure that it's there. So, if you have an invalid form, you don't use it to calculate the Minnesota tax withholding. It's the employer's responsibility to have the employee complete and submit a new form Minnesota W-4. And if they don't give you a valid form and you have an earlier valid form, that is what you continue to use. If you don't have a valid form, then you withhold as if the employee is single and claims 0 withholdings. And if an employee is a non-resident alien of the United States and the employee are subject to income tax withholding, you use Table 1 and procedure under the Minnesota adjustment for non-resident alien employees in IRS Publication 15T to determine the correct Minnesota withholding tax. Do not use this procedure for non-resident alien students from India and business apprentices from India. Also, don't use this procedure for certain non-resident aliens who are residents of South Korea. And you'll see IRS Notice 1392 for special instructions on withholding exemptions. And I am not going over either one of those in this video. So again, if you guys have any questions about anything that I went over in this video, please leave a comment below. Feel free to reach out to my firm using one of the contact us options in the video description below. Thank you for watching.